Cool. I won't touch it. Promise. Okay, cool. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name's Hassan. I think everyone's here to hear about Vue. So without further ado, I'll go through a very quick introduction of myself. That's like one of my online public profile pictures. I always joke around with people. I took this picture at a party once. I'm not a fan of Transformers. I've never watched the cartoons. I hated the movies, but it's a pretty cool picture, so I started using it from time to time. You already heard a background of myself, so I won't take too much time. I'm an engineering graduate from the University of Toronto. I graduated in 2015. Right after graduating, I joined the digital agency of a consulting group. This is where I started to help clients build and scale their front-end applications. And today, I'm a front-end developer for the commerce company known as Shopify. And I'm also based here in Toronto. I'm also the lead author of Fullstack Vue, a book I helped publish in March of last year, which is geared to be a learning guide for people interested in learning the Vue framework. And I think that's what everyone here is interested in talking about or hearing about. Usually in my presentations as of late, I like to reference something I've either watched or a movie or a book. In this particular presentation, we're going to reference the Marvel Avengers universe. For those who don't know anything about the Marvel Avengers universe, if you're living under a rock, it's a band of superheroes, consisting of Spider-Man, Iron Man, etc. Lately, there was the Avengers Endgame movie, which was a big conclusion to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or one story of it. The villain, Thanos, tried to acquire as many Infinity Stones, which gave him some sort of power in different parts of the universe. I think this was the very first cover of Thanos, if I'm not mistaken. Infinity Gauntlet, Volume 1-1 from the comics, published 2 years before I was born, which was pretty cool. So we're going to play the role of Thanos here. In the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to try to acquire as many stones or powers within the Vue ecosystem. The Vue core library, the Vue command line interface, vuex, Vue router, vue-test-utils, and a little bit of a sneak peek into what Vue 3 is expected to be. So we'll start from the very beginning. What is Vue? Vue is a progressive JavaScript framework that is approachable, versatile, and performant. Vue is recognized to be progressive because it scales down as easy as it scales up. For very simple use cases, you can use Vue like you use jQuery. You drop a single script tag and you're good to go. But it scales up as your needs start to grow. Vue is also recognized to be approachable, because as long as you know standard HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you can pretty much start working with Vue right away. It's versatile because Vue itself is a core library within an ecosystem of tools. It's performant. It takes advantage of the virtual DOM for very fast re-rendering times. So how do we actually begin or construct a Vue application? All Vue apps begin with something known as the Vue instance. If Vue is available in your application, you can construct this instance with the Vue constructor. You say new Vue, and you pass in the options that make up your Vue application. What are some of the options we can define? At the very minimum, you would most likely define the elements in your DOM that you want your Vue instance or Vue application to be mounted on top of. So here, for example, we're saying we want this Vue instance or Vue app to be mounted on the DOM elements with the ID of app. The next thing that people would often find themselves doing is they want to construct some form of data, and they want to have this data available in the template. Well, Vue simply gives us a data property to construct this data. It's just a series of key-value pairs where we can define the data of our application. So for example, if I wanted to build some simple UI about what I'm talking about right now, I can define the speaker as myself, Hassan, and I can try to bind this information on my template. The simplest way to do so is we can use the mustache syntax, the double curly braces, and we're binding the speaker data property from the Vue instance here onto the DOM elements with which Vue is available. What if we needed to bind some other information to HTML attributes? We can. So let's assume I bring a picture or an image of myself as a data property. I can bind this image data property on the source attributes of the image element in my template with the help of a directive that Vue gives us called the vbind directive. So what are directives in Vue? Vue directives help tell DOM elements to act in certain ways. There is a few different directives, but these are probably the most popular ones. We've seen the vbind directive. The vif or vshow directives conditionally show or render content. The von directive listens and acts on DOM events. The v4 directive helps render a list of items based on a data source. And the vmodel directive creates two-way data binding with form inputs. Let's talk about another property, methods. Methods are simply functions that run when explicitly called. So for example, if we needed some method to change the speaker, if somebody's getting tired of myself and I don't blame them, we can have a change speaker method that simply accesses the speaker data property of the instance and changes its value. It says dis.speaker. Dis is a reference to where the code is being written, and in this case, it's a reference to the instance itself. And we're changing it to another value, probably called, let's say, Aubrey Graham. How do we trigger methods from the template? This is where the other directive we quickly mentioned comes in. The v-on directive helps trigger Vue-specific functionality, and it listens to native DOM events that we know. So here we can have a button that has a click listener. We attach the v-on directive, and when clicked, calls the change speaker method. So now, what would we expect to happen in our UI when we actually do something here? If I was to click this button, the data property would change, but how would the template behave? In Vue, data is treated as reactive. As long as we change the data being used in the template, Vue tells the template to re-render based on that change. Now, why is just this piece of knowledge pretty important? Because this is especially different if you're coming from a traditional jQuery or JavaScript background. Traditionally, the way we change UI is DOM manipulation driven. We find the DOM we're looking for, we inspect it, we analyze it, then we make the change. In Vue, this is hardly ever needed, because in Vue, we change data, and Vue takes the responsibility to change the UI based on that data. We'll go through a few more properties before we dive into another topic. Let's talk about the computer property in Vue. Computer properties in Vue help compute complex manipulations of existing data. So for example, though this isn't complex, we can have a computer property saying, hey, we want the speaker value in the template, but we want it in uppercase format. So we'll just simply return this value and apply whatever you want to apply to it, to uppercase. How do we access this computer property? We can just simply bind it like any other data property. Why are computer properties different than us just saying having a method to return that data? Computer properties in Vue are unique because they're cached based on the dependencies they depend on. This particular computer property depends on the speaker data property. As long as the data property doesn't change, multiple calls to the same computer property will return the same cached result. Useful if you want to perform more expensive operations. Vue also gives us the ability to watch properties. Watchers allow us to react to data changes. We can watch the speaker property and say, hey, at any time, if the speaker value ever changes, do something. And in this case, we can just log something to the console. There also exists something known as lifecycle hooks. Lifecycle hooks are functions that occur through the life cycle of a Vue instance. There are 4 stages of the life of an instance: the creation stage, the mounted stage, the updated stage, and the destroyed stage. At any of these stages, we have access to the actual function that occurs and a function right before this stage. Of the most popular, in my opinion, is probably the created lifecycle hook, because when the created lifecycle hook runs, the Vue instance is being created, however, it hasn't been mounted. So oftentimes, it's the best moment to make any asynchronous calls to get the data you need to populate the template. Everything we've talked about has been within the context of a single instance, but if our application was to grow, things can get pretty messy. And this is why Vue allows us to group things in separate pieces known as Vue Components. Vue Components are self-contained modules that can group markup, logic, and even styles. The simplest way to define a Vue component is to use the vue.components constructor. This registers the component globally. The first argument is the name of the component, and the second argument is the options that make the component. What are the options that make up the components? Pretty much everything we've talked about before. This is because Vue components are Vue instances. We can have methods, data, computer properties, lifecycle hooks, and so on and so on. There's a few key differences, however. One is that components can't use root-specific functionality. So we can't, and we shouldn't, have a component be mounted onto a DOM element. That's the responsibility of the root instance. The second is data must always be a function, because Vue under the hood expects the functions to return new objects to differentiate between the data for different instances or components, something we just must adhere to. And another property that's pretty popular or needed within components is the template property. This is because in components, we can't mount it to the DOM, so we have to say what is the template of the component itself. So here, the template property is a string, and it defines the markup of the component. So in this case, it's just a div element that has a header and a paragraph tag. Now, though this works well, there's some issues here, right? The first is the template option is in string format. This works for simple applications, but as your app starts to grow and your markup of the components grows, there's no syntax highlighting. The second isn't probably as difficult, but it'll be nice to have. We've been able to group markup and the logic, but we haven't been able to isolate CSS tiling. Well, Vue recognizes this and gives us another approach to defining components, single file components. However, we'll take a step back here because single file components are only made possible with the build tools like Webpack. So with that being said, we got our first stone. We have a good understanding of the Vue core library. We have quite a bit of way to go. So we assumed, or I assumed, that everything I was talking about so far has been within the context of building simple standalone Vue applications. So you drop a script tag, you reference Vue as a content delivery network, and you're good to go. And Vue is fantastic because it's easy to get started. But as your needs start to grow, you might want to do more things. You might want to work within a module-based environment, configure Babel, style preprocessors, ESLint, TypeScript perhaps, single file components. Now, these are either practically impossible or really difficult in simple standalone Vue applications, which is why we oftentimes would want to work within a more robust setting. So let's say a Webpack bundled setting. But trying to do this on our own and trying to create the setting is difficult, and oftentimes is known as, typical JavaScript fatigue, because not everyone does this, which is why Vue helps us here as well. Vue gives us the Vue CLI, which is a command line tool that helps with the rapid building and developing of Webpack bundled Vue applications. How do we use the Vue CLI? We first have to install it globally in our working machine, assuming you have npm node available. You create a new Vue project, you say vue create, and you simply follow the prompts and create. What does the command line allow for? It literally allows us to select what we want. Do we want TypeScript, PWA support, a router, vuex, CSS preprocessors, a linter, etc., etc., etc. And once selected and once run, we get a Webpack bundled working project that looks something like this. If you've never worked within this setting, it might be intimidating, but if you have, it's actually not that difficult. The node modules folder refers to all the locally installed npm packages. The public folder oftentimes has the root markup page our Vue app is mounted on top of. The source directory is usually where all our Vue code lives, and we're pretty much good to go. The Vue CLI is especially helpful and especially cool because it's the only command line tool that I've used that has a really intuitive UI to it. If we wanted to, we can actually create a project with the UI, and we can see the features and configuration of a project through the UI as well, which is pretty cool. Now that we know how we can quickly set up a Webpack bundled project, let's talk about what these magical single file components are. Single file components allow us to define the markup, logic, and CSS of a component all within a single .vue file. And it does so by allowing us to group the markup within a template section, the logic within a script section, and the style within a styles section. So here's an example of a very simple single file component. We'll break it down step by step. The template is the markup of the component. So here we have a div element with a header, and we're familiar with the mustache syntax. It's simply binding some property that exists called speaker. The script section is the logic of the component. This is where we define the data, the computer properties, methods, anything we want in this component. In this case, we're simply returning the speaker property bound in the template. Now, the unique thing as well with the single file components is we have a style section. We can define the styles that can be used within the component. If we use the scoped tag, this allows us to scope these styles only to this component alone, so no other component can actually access it. Okay, that was a pretty quick win to getting the Vue CLI. We have 2 stones right now. We have 4 more remaining. Let's talk about how we can sort of manage data within our application. We've mentioned that components are the building blocks of Vue applications. However, one thing we haven't said yet is components can render other components. So you have parent and children relationships. What if we wanted to pass data from a parent component down to a child? Vue gives us the ability to use something known as props to do this. We'll go through a very brief example in how props work. They're pretty straightforward. Assume we have a parent component here in a parent component.vue file, and in the script section, we're importing a child component, and we're registering it in the component's property. This is another way of defining components. Instead of having them globally registered, you can simply register the components you want to use in the parent within the component's property. This parent component also has a speaker data property of myself, Hassan Djirdeh. And in the template, all it does is it renders this child component, but it uses the vbind directive to bind the speaker data property in the component to a speaker prop that's being passed to the child. What does the child component need to do? All the child component needs to do, if it wants to use this prop, is declare the prop within a props property, and it can access it like any other data property. So in this case, it just simply binds it onto the template. This is amazing. However, props can only be used to pass data down. What if we wanted the child to sort of communicate something up? In this case, we'll have to use something known as custom events. Vue custom events behave very similar to native JavaScript custom events, but there's one key distinction. Vue custom events are used primarily for communication between components. To fire off a custom event, we say $emit. The this keyword is a reference to the instance, so we're saying the instance emit a custom event. The first argument is the name of the event, and the second argument is the data that we can actually pass with this event. So here's an example. Let's bring back that parent-child component relationship, and let's see how an event can be used. In the child component, we've now introduced a button element. And this button has a click listener with the vOn directive. What does this button do when clicked? It fires off a custom event. It says $emit this event, and the name of this event is change speaker. What does the parent need to do here? If it wants to listen for this event, it needs to declare this listener as to where the child component is being rendered. How do we listen for events and trigger Vue-specific functionality? We can still use the vOn directive. So we listen for the change speaker event, and now we're doing inline functionality change to simply change the speaker value in this component to Aubrey-Graham. Amazing. So now we know that props can be used to pass data down, and child components can use custom events to notify the parent about something. But what if we wanted to do something to have these two different sibling components sort of communicate with one another? Could we use custom events the way we've seen? Well, we can't, because we use the components events interface to fire an event, and as a result, we have to declare the listener where that component is being rendered. For two different sibling components, one isn't being rendered within the other. So this is usually, most of the time, where people take a step back and think, okay, how do I actually want to manage more complicated data as I start to introduce more and more components to my app? There's roughly three main ways that I can specify. You can use a global event bus, you can use a simple form of state management, or you can use the flux-like state management library vuex. An event bus is just a global Vue instance that helps isolated components to subscribe and publish custom events between one another. It does so by being made global. Simple form of state management is just a store object that contains state and the methods needed to mutate that state. Components simply use this store to actually communicate with one another. Since we don't have all day today, I'm just going to dive straight into vuex and spend more time with vuex. Vuex is a flux-like state management library built solely for use with Vue. Now, what is Flux? Flux is a pattern, a design pattern that was actually created by Facebook in 2013. That was a pattern to help handle client-side data. It's composed of 4 parts organized as a one-way data pipeline: action, dispatcher, store, and view. The view or components simply call actions. Actions commit or dispatch store mutations. Store mutations mutate store state, and the view that depends on the state gets re-rendered to show that change. So let's see how vuex adapts to this. Since vuex is a library, it needs to be introduced, npm, yarn, etc. And for module-based apps, Vue would want us to install the vuex plugin. So we say vue.use vuex, where Vue is an import of the Vue library, and vuex is an import of the vuex library. Then we can actually create the vuex store. We can create the vuex store with the vuex.store constructor. There are 4 options that make up a vuex store. state, mutations, actions, and getters. State and mutations are necessary to make your store. Actions and getters don't have to be used, but are pretty important to make your store more robust. And once your store is created, to have it available everywhere in your Vue application, you simply pass it into the root level instance of your app. So let's break down each of the pieces of the store. State is pretty self-explanatory. It's the data we want handled within an app. So let's assume we want one speaker property to be handled within maybe multiple components, and the value is Hassan Djirdeh. Mutations are functions responsible in mutating store state. In Flux architectures, mutations are usually denoted in capital letters to distinguish them from other functions. In vuex, mutations always have access to state as the first argument, and the state is the state of the store. In this case, they may or may not have access to a potential payload that can be passed in from something else. This mutation expects that payload and simply updates the state speaker value with that payload. Actions exist to call mutations. In addition, actions exist to perform any or all asynchronous work prior to committing to mutations. Like mutations, actions have access to a special property right away. They have access to a context object. Context provides access to a few different things. It provides access to the state of your store, context.state. It provides access to the getters of your store, context.getters. And it provides access to a commit function that needs to be used to commit to a mutation. Here we have a very simple action that does nothing else but commit to the update speaker mutation we showed earlier, and it passes the payload that it expects, Aubrey Graham. Getters are to a vuex store, what computed properties are to a Vue component. They're often used to help compute more complicated data, and they're cached based on the dependencies. Getters always have access to the state of your store as the first argument. In this case, we have a very simple getter that simply returns the speaker value from state. So what do components do with a well-built store? They usually do one of two things. They either get state data through getters or state, or they dispatch actions. So here we have a single file component that's going to interact with the store. We'll look at the script section first. In the script, we can see a computer property and the methods property being used. The computer property getSpeaker simply returns the value from the getSpeaker getter in the store. How does it do it? It says this.$store.getters.getSpeaker. How do we access this .store? This is because the store is now available everywhere in our Vue app. The methods do something very similar. You have an update speaker method that simply dispatches the update speaker action. It says this.store dispatch the action. And in the template, we simply access what the component can use. We simply access the update speaker method, and we simply compute or return the value of the getSpeaker computer property in the text content. So if the user was to click this header element, there's a bunch of things that would actually happen. The update speaker method gets called from the component. The update speaker action is dispatched. The update speaker action commits to the update speaker mutation in the store. The store mutation mutates store state. When the store state is changed, the getter value is changed, the computed getSpeaker value is changed, and the template re-renders. So vuex deliberately introduces this pipeline of changes so we can conform to a more structured way of handling data. Obviously, for a simple use case like this, it's probably not necessary, but as your application is large, it's pretty important. The other significant advantage behind vuex is that it integrates with Vue DevTools for time travel debugging. So this is a shopping cart application that was used in the Fullstack Vue book. And the Vue DevTools is a development tool for Chrome or Firefox that provides useful debugging capabilities for Vue applications. There is a vuex tab. This vuex tab allows us to track every single mutation that actually happens in our store. In fact, we're also able to see the store information, such as the state and getters, at a particular moment in time. And a very cool feature is you can actually time travel your UI back to a particular mutation. So when it comes to finding out where something went wrong or if a bug occurs, this is a really, really helpful feature. Okay, so that was a pretty big topic. The next are going to be a little bit smaller. We only have 3 more stones left. At this moment, the Avengers are panicking. I don't blame them. Like, we're almost there, but we're not done yet. So let's talk about another quick topic, routing. So routing often refers to splitting an application's UI based on rules derived from the browser URL. We're all familiar with routing, right? Even if you don't think about it. let's take an application as an example, twitter.com. If I go to the index route and I'm logged in as a user, I expect to see this page. I expect to see a list of tweets, a list of potential followers, etc., etc., etc. But if I was to go to, let's say, my profile page, twitter.com/whatever my username is, I expect to see this page, right? This is what routing is. Routing helps split an application's UI based on rules from the URL. Why is this helpful, or why is this useful? Because routing helps us refresh pages and keep our location in the app. It helps us bookmark URLs, share it with others. It helps us maintain browser back-forward history functionality. Oftentimes in web applications, there's one of two ways to do routing. You have server-side routing or client-side routing. We're only going to focus on client-side routing today. Client-side routing is when the client only makes a request to the server upon initial page load. And since the client has all the information it needs, oftentimes it's labeled as a single-page application. And in modern frameworks, JavaScript is used to dynamically render different page content based on the rules of the URL. And this is where Vue Router comes in. Vue Router is the official router of Vue. It deeply integrates with Vue to make building single-page applications a breeze. Since it's an external library, it will need to be introduced into your application. And once available, Vue would want us to install the plugin in a module-based setting. We say vue.use Vue Router, where Vue is an import of the Vue library, and Vue Router is an import of the Vue Router library. When we're using Vue Router, the first thing we often need to construct is a routes map or array that helps tell the router which component is going to be shown for which respective path name. So here we have a routes array that contains 3 objects, with each object having a path key and a component key. Assume we've already created these components and we've imported it here. We're basically telling this routes array that, hey, we want the Twitter index component to be shown in the index path. We want a Twitter about component to be shown in an about path. And we want the Twitter user profile component to be shown in a user ID path. That ID is a dynamic route because whatever the user types would allow for this component to show. Once the routes array is available, all we need to do is pass it into the Vue Router constructor. We can construct a router saying new Vue Router and specify the options that we need in the router. The routes array is the one option that is a requirement to construct your router. Here we've introduced another property called mode history, which helps tell our router that we want our URLs in history mode, so we don't need the hash symbol in our URLs, which are usually helpful in server-rendered applications. But if we're building a single-page app, this is probably more appropriate. And once the router is constructed, all we need to do is pass it into the application root instance. And our app will now be router aware. What does that mean? In our components, we can now access a few components that Vue Router gives us. We can access a router view component that's responsible in rendering another component based on the app's location. We can access a router link component that allows for a change in browser location without making a web request. So here's an example single file component that uses this potential router we've created. Assume in the template, we wanted a child component to show based on the URL the user is in. We'll just need to place the router view component. That component will determine which component should show based on the route. If we wanted to provide links to allow the user to navigate from route to route, this is where we can use the router link component. It takes a to-prop of the particular path we want to take the user to. Now, why don't we use anchor tags here? Anchor tags would work, but anchor tags actually make a web request. If we're building a true single-page app, we don't need to make any web requests. We're available with everything we have, so we could use the router link component. Now, if we actually built these components and made them look really good like this, if we were to run our application and go to these routes, we would see these particular components being rendered. We will see the index component be shown in the index path, the about component shown in the about path, and the profile component being shown in the user ID path. Now, this is just the start to what Vue Router provides. We've quickly talked about dynamic route matching, but there's a lot of other things as well. We could do things like nested routes. We can do things like navigation guards. We can do things like async loading with Webpack, and etc., etc. Wow, okay, we only have 2 more stones, if I'm not mistaken. We're almost there. So let's talk about one big piece of what everyone should do when they build applications, testing. Why is testing helpful or useful in software development? Testing helps reveal bugs before they appear, they instill confidence, and they make it easy to onboard new developers on an existing code base. There, once again, is 2 main ways people often do testing with large-scale applications, end-to-end testing or unit testing, but we're going to focus our efforts today on unit testing, where tests are only made to parts of an application in isolation. And this is where the vue-test-utils library comes in to help us. The vue-test-utils library is a utility library that provides useful methods that help make testing easier, right? Since it's an external library, it needs to be introduced, and once available, oftentimes in our test files, we can import the functions that we need to help mount our components in our tests. So for example, we can import a mount function that can be used in our test files to mount a potential component we can create, let's say speaker component, and create this wrapper. What is this wrapper? This wrapper is a mounted version of this component that provides a series of useful methods and utilities to help assert what we're looking for. So if in our test we want to access the component instance, we can say wrapper.vm. If we wanted to retrieve the component's HTML, we can run the HTML function on this wrapper. If we wanted to find an element, we just say wrapper find, and that helps find the element in wrapper form. If you wanted to get the props of this particular component, we just use the props function. If you wanted to trigger an event, we say trigger. If you wanted to set methods, and so on and so forth. In fact, if you go to the vue-test-utils documentation, you'll see a large list of utility functions and helpers that can help make testing easier. And this is a good visualization of this wrapper, right? This wrapper wraps the component and provides all these methods in our tests. So assume we were creating a test and we already had a testing framework set up. People use different things, Jest, Mocha, Shy within the JavaScript ecosystem. We'll assume we're using Jest here, but they all look very similar. Our test file could perhaps look something like this. We'll import the components we want to test because we want to make sure we're testing things in isolation. So we'll test components piece by piece. And we'll import the function from the vue-test-utils library that'll help us mount our components. There's a few different functions that exist. Here we're using a shallow mount function, which mounts the component, but stubs all the child components. So it's actually pretty faster, a little bit faster. And then we can have our describe and it blocks in our tests that help, structure our test files. In the beginning of our describe block, we can use our, testing frameworks before each function that allow us to create this wrapper before every unit test. And then in our it blocks, we can make our assertions in our tests. So for example, for some simple tests, we could say it should render the correct initial content. The expect and to be functions are from the assertion library, but how we access the wrapper comes from vue-test-utils. So for example, we can say find me the element with the class of title, run the text function from this wrapper, and assert it's supposed to be what it's expected to be. And the same for the one below. Give me the speaker data property. How do we access it? With the wrapper, we can access the instance with the VM property, so wrapper.vm, and make it equal to whatever is expected to do. Okay, things are looking good for us. Only one more stone to collect, and the Avengers are going nuts right now. So there's one last thing that I think is pretty cool to talk about. So everything we've talked about so far has been within the context of Vue 2.x, 2.6 in particular. At this moment, the Vue core team are in the proposal stage for Vue 3. And there's been a few RFCs or requests for comments that talk about what the new API may have or not have. There's been some changes, some drops here and there, but as of now, there's currently a pull request from Evan Yu with the most recent RFC that looks like is getting a bit more traction. And this RFC is the composition API RFC. And it proposes a new set of additive function-based APIs that allow for flexible composition of component logic. There's two keywords here to me: additive and function-based. So here's an example code that was actually shared in the RFC documentation. Just looking at this right away, we're all Vue experts now. This looks very similar to what we've seen before. We have a template section, a script section. It's a single file component. However, in the script section, things might look a little bit different than what I showed. In this case, we're importing a reactive and computed functions from the Vue library. And in our options, we're only using something known as a setup option. No other option. And we could probably think what this setup function is supposed to do. It's supposed to set up our Vue components or instance. Within the setup function, we can have a state object be constructed with the reactive function to make it reactive. If we wanted a property to be cached or be computed, we could use the computed function from the import. We can declare a new function within setup to help change our state, something like increment. And then we can return what the template actually needs. So in this case, it just returns the state and the increment function. The template remains largely unchanged. We just simply access what we need the way we've seen. So we use the directives that we already know. v-on click, call the increment function, and bind the values that we're looking for, in this case, the mustache syntax. Now, with that being said, there's a few things to address here. The reason behind this potential RFC is two things. One is better type inference, and the other is better logic reuse. People have noticed that though single file components in Vue are amazing, trying to use TypeScript with them isn't the easiest. The second is better logic reuse. People have also noticed that breaking down large single file components isn't very intuitive. And this is what this composition API is supposed to do. It's supposed to allow us to declare functions, so these functions can be declared elsewhere and shared between components. Some takeaways. This particular RFC does not deprecate anything we've done in Vue 2, so that all remains the same. It's an additive process. We're going to add a set of new functions. Second big takeaway is this is still in the proposal stage, so if this does change, don't blame me. And then I think we're done, folks. With a snap of our fingers, or finger, we can now build Vue applications easily. So that's pretty much the end of the presentation. I'm going to put a few plugs before I close the day. As I mentioned, I work at Shopify. So if anyone's interested in what I do at Shopify, want to talk more about it, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. I'm part of the platform team where I help build the UI other app developers actually work with on Shopify. My stack in the last couple of years has actually been React, GraphQL, and TypeScript. It's been great. I really, really enjoy my experience, and you're more than welcome to talk to me about this. If anybody's interested in diving more about Vue and wants a more robust resource, the Fullstack Vue book might be helpful. If you want details, you can check out the newline.io/Vue website. Newline, since the Fullstack brand is going through a rebrand. There's also Web Unleashed discounts, gumroad.com/L/VueFull/WebView19. It's a bit of a mouthful of a URL, but if anybody wants to actually use this, you're more than welcome to just message me later or ask me. Another plug I do want to make, I am working on a pretty large online course at this moment in time, focused on building an entire production app from scratch. It's called Tiny House. Probably mentioning it now so I can be held accountable. The first launch is estimated in mid-November, the second launch being in January. It's a lot here, but feel free to follow my social media if you're interested. As mentioned at the beginning of the day, before this presentation, I have a twin brother that looks just like me. So if you see someone that is a little bit rude or a little evil, it's not me, it's my brother. I'm just joking. So he actually works at Google. He's a developer advocate. He's speaking today at 3:30, speed at Google, what's new. He hasn't told me yet, so I'll probably be there to find out. And with that being said, I'll be here for most of today. Welcome to come up to me. I love talking to people. This is my social media. Do follow me. And thank you, everyone. I enjoyed this. Hopefully you guys learned something. Thank you.